This is the third and final installment to our Keeping Passover and Unleavened Bread in 2022 discussions. This installment is entitled Keeping Passover by Way of the Renewed Covenant in Spirit and in Truth. And if by chance you did not read or listen to parts 1 or 2 of this 3-part discussion on keeping Passover and unleavened bread in 2022, I'd humbly encourage you to do so by clicking the link to this post in this post transcript. Question for you. Should we, under the auspices of the renewed covenant, keep the Passover, keep Pesach, as laid out before us in Torah? Or should we, as many do each year, partake in a traditional Jewish Seder or Jewish type of Seder or Passover? Or should we rehearse Yehoshua's Last Supper as sort of a replacement of Passover, as some have sought to do? Or should we simply follow the leading of Yah's Ruach HaKodesh, his Holy Spirit, and keep Passover or Pesach in some form of spirit and truth? Well, let's look at each of these questions one by one and see if we can come to some biblically based reasonable answers. Number 1, should we, under the auspices of the renewed covenant, keep the Passover or Pesach as laid out before us in Torah? Well, as we've concluded several times during the previous installment, we cannot keep Passover. We cannot keep Pesach as Yah passed it down to our ancient Hebrew cousins. The ordinance as rendered at the time of the Exodus, under the auspices of the original covenant, was related specifically to our departure out of Egypt. And Yah attached a number of requirements with that particular version of Passover, such as slaying the lamb that we selected back on the 10th day of the month of the Aviv, between the 2 evenings of the 14th of the month of Aviv. So applying the blood we collected from that slaughtered lamb upon the doorpost and lintel of our homes, so as to protect us, to cover us from the destroyer as he went throughout the land of Egypt to kill the firstborn. Each participating male of the Passover meal would have to be physically circumcised. Consuming the roasted Pesach that evening, we would be fully dressed with our staffs in hand and consume the meal in haste, and so forth. All of this outlined in Exodus or Shemot chapter 12. Everything would need to be completed before morning, and then at the second anniversary of the original Passover that was given, a second Passover is added to facilitate those of our community who, for whatever reason, were not in a position, either physically or spiritually, to properly keep Passover. And so purity regulations were added to the keeping of Pesach by Yah's covenant people at that time. And that's in Numbers or Bamidbar chapter 9. Later on, Yah provided that once we were in the land of promise, we would conduct a pilgrimage to the place where he chose to put his name. And it would be at this place where he places his name that we would select the Pesach, have it slaughtered, and then consume the Pesach as a community at that central location where Yah's name is placed, where the tabernacle or the temple stood. And then when all is done and said, we would return to our temporary dwellings in the morning. Deuteronomy chapter 16. It should be understood that the very last instructions Abba provided us in his Torah regarding our keeping of Passover or Pesach should be the set of instructions that we would follow at least up to the time that our master came to minister to us in Deuteronomy chapter 16. But since we no longer have a functioning Levitical priesthood to officiate the Pesach proceedings, and we no longer have a standing and functioning temple in Jerusalem, we can't keep most of the elements of Pesach as outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 16. Not to mention that Yehoshua HaMashiach fulfilled the role of the Pesach lamb for us once and for all. Rav Shaul wrote to the Messianic Assembly in Corinth regarding this aspect of Yehoshua's ministry in person. And this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. For our Passover is the Mashiach, the Messiah who was slain for us. Shimon Kepha, the Apostle Peter, wrote of our Master as our Pesach. And this is in his first letter, his first apostolic letter, chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Since you know that neither with perishable silver nor with gold you were redeemed from your vain doings, which you had by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of that lamb, in which is not spot nor blemish, namely the Messiah, the Mashiach. So, beloved, there are no sheep to take into our homes. There are no sheep to slaughter on Passover. There is no blood from those sheep of which to apply to our homes. And then we're not to consume the meat from that Pesach in haste at night. Yehoshua, our Messiah, is our only Passover or Pesach. To do otherwise, to follow the first iteration of Passover, or even the second iteration of Passover, would essentially ignore the sacrifice made by our Master, Yehoshua. His sacrifice should be the Pesach sacrifice that we focus on during Pesach and unleavened bread. Oh, we should certainly reference, with all the reverence we can muster, the Pesach of the original covenant, but that's not where our redemption and salvation lays or rests. If, however, you are so led to keep Pesach as outlined in Torah, I say have at it. It's not my place to judge or condemn any who are led to do anything they read in Torah. I've heard of at least one individual over the years, a prominent Messianic teacher on the internet, who made it publicly known that he intended to keep Passover as outlined in Exodus chapter 12, at least back a few years ago. I don't know if he's still doing it. And from what I understand, he ended up doing that very thing. Whether he's, again, since I don't know if he's still doing it, but the point of my bringing this up is that this gentleman, who I highly respect and regard as a brother in the true faith once delivered, well, he has a sizable following in the Messianic community. And although he made it known to his viewers and listeners that he was not encouraging them to follow his lead, no doubt countless individuals did follow his lead. And this is potentially a tragedy. It's a tragedy because when we blindly keep Torah without keeping in mind and heart the spirit and truth behind each Torah instruction and mitzvah, regardless how pure our intentions may be, we end up being no different than the Pharisees and scribes who potentially leave undone the weightier matters of Torah, such as justice and mercy and faith, and we nullify the full impact of our Master's sacrifice. Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. We must never forget that Yehoshua is the end. He is the telos of Torah. He is the focus, the fulfillment, the fullness of Torah that we must consider first and foremost in our operating and keeping Torah. Romans chapter 10, verse 4. Second question to address: should we, as many do each year, partake in a traditional Jewish Seder or Jewish type of Seder or on Passover? I stated in Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections 28 that that was the last one. That was the last, Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections that we posted. Entitled Sabbath Shabbat Haggadol. It was entitled Shabbat Haggadol. That's what happens when you are getting old as I am. You forget these things. That I mentioned in that I had serious reservations about what we know as Jewish Seders. Jewish Seders are supposedly fashioned in accordance with the elements of the first Passover of Exodus or Shemot 12. But like everything else in Judaism, the Passover Seder is highly, or has been highly, regulated by the rabbis. In fact, the so-called Seder is a rabbinic invention that looks and operates nothing like the Pesach meal of Exodus or Shemot 12. Many of the elements that make up the Seder meal seem to carry with it pagan symbolism, let's say, none of which I will get into in this discussion. However, if you're interested in that which I'm alluding to here regarding the Jewish Seder, I would encourage you, when you get the chance, to simply conduct an internet search and look up what constitutes the Jewish Seder. And then compare and contrast what constitutes a Jewish Seder today with that which is detailed in Exodus chapter 12 and Deuteronomy chapter 16. And I'm pretty confident you will agree with my assessment that it is not something that Yah's elect should be involving themselves with during this sacred time of the biblical calendar year. Which brings me to the third question or point. Number 3. Should we rehearse Yehoshua's Last Supper as sort of a replacement of Passover, as some have sought to do, or as some do? Well, this is an extremely important point and question, if you ask me. We find in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, and John 13 what many within and outside of our faith community refer to as the Last Supper. It is the night that our Master Yehoshua was betrayed, when he instituted the ritual of what many call today as communion, the sharing of bread. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, we find that bread was actually leavened bread, arton in the Greek, lechem in the Aramaic. And if this were in fact the Passover or Pesach or Seder meal, only unleavened bread can be provided for the meal. And then wine. And it's where he washed his disciples' feet, and in a show of humility that many have over the centuries revered as a ritual to be followed even today by Yah's people. It turns out that many within and outside our faith community believe that Yehoshua was actually crucified on what would turn out to be Passover day for that year. Master Yehoshua literally playing out the role of the Pesach lamb. But this time, he would be the lamb that would take away the sins of the world. I happen to be one of those who believe he was crucified on Passover or Pesach that year, as well as I believe that the so-called Last Supper was held the night prior or before that Passover day. However, I do recognize that there is vocal opposition to this theory, strongly advocating the theory that Master was crucified on the first day of unleavened bread and so forth. Both theories drum up some serious questions demanding answers. In terms of the theory that Master was crucified on Passover day, is that Matthew chapter 26, verse 19, Mark chapter 14, verse 12, and Luke chapter 22, verse 7, they all mention that the so-called Last Supper took place on the first day of unleavened bread, or on Passover, which is the 14th day of the month of Aviv. Which, if the text is accurate, makes for an impossibility that Master was crucified on Passover day, because he yet had his Last Supper with his disciples. But then, these same texts also paint a problem for the crucifixion taking place on the first day of unleavened bread as well. For any Orthodox Jew to have any participation in a crucifixion on such a high holy day would be also an impossibility. So both theories have problems associated with them in terms of what the gospel record states. Now, the one other theory that I've come across of late has Yehoshua Messiah being crucified not on Passover Day, but on a Friday, preparation day, during the week of unleavened bread, the preparation day for the weekly Sabbath during that week. Kind of reminiscent of the Good Friday of the Catholic faith, huh? But there is a small group of people that honestly believe that Master died on Friday. And I can see some possibilities in this theory, believe it or not, but there remains a great more investigation to be had on my part before I abandon my current stance of him being crucified on Passover Day for these other two. And I'll comment just a little bit more about it in just a minute. As I mentioned, I adhere to Master being crucified on Passover or Pesach. And there are just too many parallels between the events that make up the crucifixion day and the events that routinely take place in Jerusalem on Passover Day. But for the sake of time, we won't go over those parallels here. The point of debate as to when the so-called Last Supper was held and what day Yehoshua was actually crucified falls heavily upon Matthew's record of the events found in chapter 26, verse 17. And the New King James Version modified reads, "Now on the first," the Greek word for first here is protos, "on the first or protos day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yeshua saying to him, 'Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?'" Now, the Greek term protos, as used in this verse, most likely means, from a contextual standpoint, the day in front of or before the Passover day, which is always on the 14th day of the month of Aviv, with the first day of unleavened bread always commencing at sundown on the 14th day of the month of Aviv, virtually on the heels of unleavened bread. Now, Yochanan's, John's gospel record, is slightly clearer on this critical point. John chapter 13, verse 1, again referencing the New King James Version modified. Now before, that being the Greek word pro, contextually meaning the day before. Now, the day before the feast of the Passover, when Yehoshua knew that his hour had come that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. To insist that Master's last meal with his disciples was the Pesach meal, and that it took place on Passover night, are ignoring some important critical points that are often left inadequately addressed by those in opposition. But in support of Master being crucified on Passover, given the gospel record challenging this claim, I turn to Michael Rood's chronological gospels for an explanation for the disparity here. And this is from his chronology, a commentary part here. Michael Rood writes, quote, "Preparations began on the 9th day of the Aviv and continued through the late afternoon of the 14th. A rented upstairs apartment in Jerusalem, the famous upper room, was prepared for Passover and for their extended domicile through the Feast of Shavuot. The parenthetical summary details where the Last Supper would take place, not when the preparation was made. The night in which the Last Supper occurred was the last evening in which leaven could be consumed. This is also the disciples' first night in Jerusalem after spending the previous weeknights in Bethany on the Mount of Olives." Now, regardless what one may think about Michael Rood, I will say that I find his work of the chronological Gospels to be a decent reference, a sound reference in many ways. A lot of research was put into this compilation, and I'm afraid that many in our faith community discount his work here because they don't care for the author, Michael Rood, for whatever reason. Well, that's too bad in my opinion. And if that's indeed the case, then it is what it is. And I will continue to reference this publication from time to time as needed, at least until such a time that its content is proved wrong or inaccurate. But assuming that Master Yehoshua was crucified on Passover Day, and a lot of folks agree with me, I'm not in the minority by a long shot, then that would mean the so-called Last Supper took place the night before Passover, or Erev Pesach. And if this is in fact true and accurate, then what Yehoshua and his disciples engaged in the night of the Last Supper was not the Passover or Pesach meal, or as popularly referred to as the Seder. It was simply Master having a final meal with his disciples, during which he institutes the renewed covenant in his blood for the remission of sin, and the eating of the bread, which represented his broken body. During that dinner, the betrayer is revealed, and Yehoshua washes his disciples' feet. Also, Master reveals that Shimon Kepha would betray him 3 times before the crowing of the cock the following morning. And lastly, he renders unto the 11 remaining disciples, after Judas departs, one last lesson before the group departs out to the Mount of Olives. So, for me, it's unlikely that Master Yehoshua kept Passover as any devout Jew of his day would that year. He didn't keep Pesach that year because he became our Pesach on that Passover day. He was removed from his execution stake, hastily cleaned up, and placed in the borrowed tomb before sundown, which would be the time of the Pesach observance for all observing Jews in Jerusalem that year, as well as at sundown, the start of the 7-day-long Hag HaMatzah, or Feast of Unleavened Bread. Remember, during Master's hasty trial before Pilate, the Jewish leaders were concerned about prolonging the trial too long into the day, such that they were up against the clock and could not risk being in a position where they could not keep or properly be in a position to keep Pesach or unleavened bread in accordance with Torah. That being said, the so-called Last Supper would have nothing to do with the Passover meal and any associated ceremonies that tradition might bring up. But we'll leave this debate alone for now and continue on with our discussion on keeping Passover and unleavened bread in the renewed covenant. So then, with all that we've just covered in this discussion, how are we, Yah's redeemed and elect, to honor, celebrate, keep Passover and unleavened bread? Well, we're not expected necessarily to rehearse the elements of the so-called Last Supper, although many in our faith community do. Or folks in our faith community simply default to participating in a variation or form of the classic Jewish Seder, which Yah never ordained nor instructed us to do. And this brings us to the fourth option or question, which is to keep the feast in spirit and in truth. Unless we're focused on the greater meaning and shadows that Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread paints for us during this set-apart season, we run the great risk, of blindly keeping the feast and missing or overlooking that which Abba so desperately wants us to take away from our time together with him. First and foremost, unless we stop and truly recognize and appreciate the sacrifice that our Master Yehoshua made on our behalf, the cost of the atonement he made for our sins, and the redemption that was paid for our release from the bondage and slavery to the gods of this world, unless we renew our vow to take up our stakes and follow him, giving all to follow him, then Passover may very well be nothing more than a passing Hebrew holiday, a lamb meal, and conceivably time spent with friends and family, good times spent with friends and family. Our obligation as Yah's set-apart people is to keep Yehoshua at the forefront of our thoughts and hearts during this Passover or Pesach. Master instructed his disciples, and by extension us today, to remember him in whatever we do during Passover. Luke chapter 22, verses 17 through 19, and I'm going to use Root's chronology rendering based upon the New King James Version, I believe. Verse 17 of the 22nd chapter of Luke. Yeshua took the cup and gave thanks and said, "Take this cup and divide it among yourselves. For I say to you," verse 18, "I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of Jehovah shall come." Verse 19, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body which is given to you. Do this in remembrance of me." I would be remiss if I did not encourage each of us to remember that which Yehoshua did for us, at the very least by reading the gospel accounts of the so-called Last Supper and his sacrifice, his passion. Maybe remember him, Yeshua, as our Pesach by partaking of bread and wine during this set-apart time. Shaul told his Corinthian readers that which he personally received from our master regarding the night our master was betrayed. And this is contained in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 26. And the KJV reads, "He took bread," verse 24, "and when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me,'" verse 25. "After the same manner also he took the cup when he had supped, saying, 'This cup is the New Testament, or the new covenant in my blood. This do ye, as oft as ye drink it, in remembrance of me.'" Verse 26. "For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, ye do show the Lord's or our master's death till he come." So we're instructed to remember Yehoshua, our master and our redeemer, on Pesach. In terms of keeping Passover or Pesach in accordance with the instructions rendered unto us in the original covenant, we cannot keep it for the reasons previously mentioned. But that's okay, beloved. What we can do to honor, to observe, to keep, to guard Pesach or Passover is to remember the person and ministries of our Master Yehoshua at the very least on that day. In terms of the 7-day festival or feast of unleavened bread, or Hag Hamatzah, Torah requires that we rid our homes of all leavened foods and leavening agents, and then, from the night of the Pesach or Passover on the 14th of this month, through the last day of unleavened bread on the 21st of this month, we, 1, abstain from eating any leaven-laced or infused foods, and 2, we eat matzah sometime each day during the period of the feast. And so we do. But we do so with a purpose in mind, not simply to do that which we've been instructed to do, which we should and must, but rather to do so with a distinct purpose in mind of addressing and dealing with the leaven that presently exists in our respective lives. Leaven in Hebrew is chametz, and in the Greek it is zumi, otherwise known to us as yeast. In many passages of Scripture is emblematic of sin, of mental and moral corruption, of hypocrisy, of error, and of perversion. One of the many reasons Yah analogized sin, corruption, error, perversions, and such with yeast or leaven is because yeast, Although it may start off in very small amounts when added to foods, it has the potential of expanding to very great amounts. Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, simply described leaven to his Galatian readers in this respect. It takes only a little chametz, a little leaven, to leaven the whole batch of dough. Galatians chapter 5, verse 9. That was the complete Jewish Bible rendering. I dare say that most of us, those who listen to or read these posts, do not live sinful lives. I'm not saying that we do not sin from time to time, but we do not go out of our way to live lives of sin. And this is what makes Shaul's analysis of chametz, or leaven, so powerful to those of us who have eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts willing to do the will of our Father in heaven. It doesn't take much in the way of leaven to sin, or corruption, or error, or perversion, or hypocrisy in our lives to, over time, expand within us and lead us to living sinful lives. It doesn't take much to cause us to break covenant with Yah over time, as it expands in our lives, to put at risk our place in the kingdom of Yah. So it falls to each of us to search out the slightest remnants of chametz, or leaven, and have it purged from our respective lives. The psalmist wrote, chapter 139, verse 23, "Search me, O God, search me, O El, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts." Psalm chapter 26, verse 2. "Prove me, O Lord, O Jehovah, and try me. Purify as with fire my reins and my heart." This is exactly what we should be doing during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Not just consuming unleavened bread and avoiding leavened foods, but do these things with the purpose of mind and heart and soul, that is, to identify the leaven that exists in our respective lives, and then seek to have those leavened elements purged out or purged from our lives. Shaul understood some of the moral struggles that the Messianic members of the Corinthian assemblies were struggling and dealing with. And it was right about the time of Passover, Pesach, unleavened bread, that the apostle counseled and encouraged them to, and this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. He counseled them to get rid of the old chametz, that is, get rid of the old leaven, the remnant of sin, or error, hypocrisy, corruption that exist in their respective lives. He says, get rid of the old chametz so that you can be a new batch of dough, because in reality, you are unleavened. For our Pesach lamb, the Messiah, has been sacrificed. Verse 8. So let us celebrate the Seder. I'm not a fan of the use of the word Seder. Actually, let us celebrate the feast of Passover or Pesach, not with leftover chametz, the chametz of wickedness and evil, but with the matzah of purity and truth. You see, some of the assembly members were walking out their faith, carrying around with them, this is the Corinthians, the Messianic Assembly of Messianic Assembly over in Corinth. They were walking out their faith, carrying around with them, as Shaul described, leftover issues, leftover chametz of wickedness and evil that they had to get rid of if they wanted to make it into the kingdom. For later on in this same letter, Shaul informed them, and this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, and Stern's complete Jewish Bible reads, "Don't you know that unrighteous people will have no share in the kingdom of God, that is, the kingdom of Yah? Don't delude yourselves. People who engage in sex before marriage, that is, who fornicate, who worship idols, that is, idolaters, who engage in sex after marriage with someone other than their spouse, that is, adulterers, who engage in active or passive homosexuality, who, verse 10, steal, and who are greedy, who get drunk, who assail people with contemptuous language, who rob, none of them will share in the kingdom of Yah. Beloved, each of us carries within us remnants of leaven that have not been completely purged out of our lives. This is the optimal time during this Pesach to make that very thing happen. If we are indeed in covenant with Yah, and Yah has set himself to meet with us during this set-apart time of his biblical calendar year, we have the grand opportunity to place these remnants of chametz, or leaven, on his brazen altar, purge them out of our lives with the help of his Ruach HaKodesh, and burn them up. Give them no room for continued existence and growth in our lives. So this 7-day festival, unleavened bread, Passover in the whole, is emblematic of the sanctification process that must take place in each of us if we intend to remain in covenant with Yah and to enter his kingdom. So what will you seek Abba's help in purging out of your life? What are you going to put on that altar to have burned up during this Passover? And lastly, if you recall 2 installments ago, in our Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections installment entitled Guarding the Month of Aviv, Aviv's critical importance to God's covenant elect, well, we discussed to a lesser or greater extent the tucked away in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this day of the wave sheaf offering, or Yom HaNafar HaOmer. In that post, we discussed the importance of the barley crop's maturity to the timing of Yah's calendar and its importance to Yom HaNafar HaOmer. We also discussed that this little discussed and little understood day, that this year on our observational calendar falls on Sunday, April 24th, 2022, the very last day of the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's the observational calendar. Unfortunately, you will not find any mention of Yom HaNafar HaOmer, or the wave sheaf offering day, on your calculated Jewish calendar. But that's neither here nor there. The day of the wave sheaf offering is emblematic of our Master being the first fruits of those who Yah will raise from the dead to be his loving, faithful, transformed beings serving only him and his eternal kingdom. Revelation chapter 1, verses 4 through 6. And the complete Jewish Bible reads, from Yochanan to the 7 Messianic communities in the province of Asia. Grace and shalom to you from the one who is, who was, and who is coming, from the sevenfold Spirit before his throne. Verse 5. And from Yeshua the Messiah, the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead and the ruler of the earth's kings. To him, the one who loves us, who has freed us from our sins at the cost of his blood. Verse 6. Who has caused us to be a kingdom that is Kohanim for God, his Father. To him be the glory and the rulership forever and ever. Amen. The writer of Hebrews explains how Yehoshua, our master, fulfilled the tenets of the spiritual wave sheaf offering. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. And the complete Jewish Bible rendering reads, this son speaking of Yehoshua, is the radiance of the Shekinah, the very expression of God's essence, upholding all that exists by his powerful word. And after he had, through himself, made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of Ha-Gadolah, Ba-Moromim. That is, he sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high. Thus, our Master's atoning and redemptive sacrifice was accepted before Yah. His sacrifice was essentially weighed before Yah, and Yah accepted it on our behalf. the true manifestation of the sheaves of barley that the ancients would bring before Yah at the tabernacle or temple. And the Levitical priest would wave it before Yah, and Yah would accept that thanksgiving offering on our behalf. Well, today, because, again, we don't have a functioning temple or Levitical priesthood, nor are most of us barley farmers residing in the land of Israel, well, we cannot keep this portion of the Feast of Unleavened Bread as it was revealed to us in Yah's Torah. Therefore, we are compelled to keep this aspect of the feast in proper spirit and in truth. How so? Well, under the auspices of the original covenant, the ancients would bring of the first fruits of their barley crop to the tabernacle or temple to be what? Waved before Yah. So we too, from a related but spiritual perspective or standpoint, offer unto Yah the first of our first fruits unto him. What that actually looks like is what we are actually led to do by Yah. Some brethren are led to send to the ministries that feed them a special offering that serves as a form of worship that honors and praises Yah for his generous mercies in providing them their sustenance, their income, what have you, for the year. This type of worship is the closest form of worship that is represented by Yom Hanafat HaOmer, or the day of the wave sheaf offering. Well, others of us may be led to offer unto Yah the best of what we have to offer him in the form of our talents, our abilities, our strength, our time, our worship, that the author of Hebrews describes as offering a sacrifice of praise to Yah that is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. Truly, this is one of the little exercised offerings that folks in our faith community are cognizant to offer. But we must never overlook such a proper offering in form of worship. Regardless of what we are led to wave before Yah, let us remember what Yehoshua accomplished on our behalf and follow up that remembrance with that which Yah calls us to offer before him. Well, as far as Hillary and I are concerned, well, we tend to share bread and wine on the night before Passover day, as well as we do wash one another's feet in a show of respect and humility for that which Master showed us on the night that he was betrayed, that so-called Last Supper night. Not saying everybody needs to follow our example. It's just what we're led to do. We're following that example. Some people take exception. We weren't told to do that. Why are you doing it? Well, that's what we're led to do. Sorry about that. If it offends you, it's not meant to offend anyone. We're the ones who have to answer to Master for what we do. We realize that Yeshua was not in any way instituting a new feast. He wasn't instituting a new feast day. He wasn't adding to the elements of the Passover or the Pesach. He was simply having a last meal with his disciples. And from that solemn occasion, we draw out lessons on humility. We draw out lessons on obedience, sacrifice, love, hope, betrayal, and so many other things. And so we meditate on those lessons. In terms of Passover day, at dusk, sometime close to dinner time, actually, let's say, Hillary and I will have a meal consisting of lamb, some bitter herbs, and unleavened bread as mentioned in Torah. And we treat this time together as a solemn occasion, and we generally will partake of a teaching online from one of Yah's anointed teachers, and we'll discuss the meaning of the day, pray, maybe sing a song or two. But when sundown comes, we'll blow our shofars and welcome the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. We would have a few days before purged our home of all unleavened foods and leavening products as Torah commands. Of course, we treat the first and last day of the feast as high holy days, to be filled with fellowshipping with other like-minded brethren, most likely via online live services. We have had on occasion live contact with others, but those have become few and far between since COVID hit. But we used to do that quite frequently. And we'll keep the day, those days, those high holy days, holy, as he commanded, as Yah commands. He commanded as us, and Yah's Spirit directs us. So, and throughout the week of unleavened bread, we supplement each meal with matzah as commanded by Torah. We consume no leavened foods, and we remember what the Feast of Unleavened Bread is supposed to mean to us in spirit and in truth. It's a time of introspection, as many feast days are each calendar year. And during this time of introspection, we take assessments of our respective walks with Messiah. We see the leaven that remains in our lives, and we seek Yah's help in purging those sins from our lives. We recognize this feast as being emblematic of the lifelong sanctification process that each of us must go through as Yah's Ruach HaKodesh works in each of us each and every day, 24/7, in a process to transform us into the image of our Master Yehoshua. And it's also a time of celebration for us. Depending on our situation that year, we may uproot ourselves from our home and spend the week somewhere else, so as to spend the entire week entirely focused on the shadows and spiritual applications to be had by us from these feasts, to make sure we're not distracted by life. And we seek to come out of this 7-day feast better, or spiritually better, and even physically better than we entered it. Well, this brings us to the end of our rather lengthy discussion on keeping Passover and unleavened bread in 2022. I want to thank you for hanging in there with me. And it is my heartfelt hope, trust, and prayer that you and your families and fellowships have a blessed and overcoming, a powerful, a miracle-filled, meaningful, and safe Pesach, Passover, and unleavened bread. And until next time, beloved, and as always, may you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Take care.